Hi, in this video we're going to look at PHP functions. We will learn how to create a function, how to call it, how to pass information or arguments into a function, and how to get a value back out from a function. So functions in any programming language are valuable. They can help us to reduce or remove redundant blocks of code so that if we have something we're going to use over and over again, instead of copying and pasting or typing it in repetitively, we can bundle it together and reuse it. And that helps us to decrease the complexity of a program. Anytime you can have less code, it becomes less complex. And by virtue of doing that, that helps to reduce errors. If we can keep the code into single blocks, that makes it easier to trace down where a problem might be. And since we can modularize this, we can have multiple programmers developing different parts of a script at one time. And by reducing complexity, making it easier to find errors, being able to have multiple people work at the same time, that can save you time and, in the long run, money. Now, to get started with this, if you want to follow along, you can go to tutorialspoint.com, and the link that's up there, that will take you directly to an online editor that you can use for running and testing these examples. So Coding Ground is a really cool site that you can go to. They have a lot of different programming languages that you can use directly in online terminals, and a nice way to get started working with something without doing a complete install on your own system. So I'm going to jump into Tutorials Point and we'll work with an example. Okay, so that link takes you directly to PHP Online Tool, and we have the basic framework for an HTML document and a beginning PHP script. So to work around in here, if you just click on execute, it will run this code, and then we'll see the sample HTML output over here. So that saves us the step of uploading it to a server and then going to the browser and then testing it out. So as we said, we're going to look at how to work with functions. And in PHP, to create a function, let me just start by deleting this hello world line. And I'm going to create a function, and it starts with the keyword function, and then you give it a name. So I'm going to call this one my name. And then we have open and closing parentheses. And then inside the parentheses, we would put arguments. So we'll do an example with that coming up, but we're not going to start right off with any arguments. And then we put in a set of opening and closing curly braces. And then inside here, we would include the PHP code for what we want it to do when this function runs. So I'm just going to do a simple echo statement that says, you know, my name is Professor Gustin, right? And then I'll end that with my semicolon. So now if I come back up here and I execute this, you'll see that the message that was in here originally that printed hello world is gone. So we created a function, but it doesn't run or execute the function until we do what is called calling the function, right? So we've prepared a block of code that we want it to do, but we didn't tell it to actually do it yet. So now when you're working in PHP, your functions can appear anywhere inside your PHP script. It doesn't make any difference whether this is before we call it or after we call it, whereas in some other programming languages it will make a big difference. So let me put my function call after it, and then we'll move it to test the location of it. So to call the function, you just use the name of your function and then include the parentheses. So I'll come down here and I'll paste that in, put a semicolon in. So now this says, okay, when you reach this line, jump over here and run the code that's inside the curly braces. So if I execute it, you'll see over here my echo statement to print out the text. And as I said, I can take this and I can move it before my function, and I can execute it. Didn't see much of a change in there. What if we put in a break tag just so that we can see something a little different over there? Right, so I'll execute, and then you'll see my break tag show up. So a lot of times when I'm working, I'll put my functions at the end so that I can have the main part of my code running up here and then just dive deeper to the end of the document. Or we could even put this in a separate PHP file and then include it in. So that's creating a function, and then now you know how to call a function. There's other things that we can do with it, like we can pass information into a function so that it has some data that is available from outside of our script or outside of our function. So let's start with, let me pass in, so I'm going to pass this string into my name. So when it gets to the function, I'm going to need a variable to capture that. So I'm going to call it last. And instead of Guston here, right, I'm going to say use the variable last. So when this calls the function, it's going to pass this string here. This gets passed in and it becomes the variable last. And then in here we're going to print it out. So execute, and we get the exact same result because it's really just substituting this string with this variable, which is the same information. What if I wanted to pass in two pieces of information? So just to make this a little different, let me just call it prof instead of professor. And then I'm going to separate this with a comma. And then I need a variable here to capture the first one, so I'll call it first, separated with a comma. So that means prof gets passed in as first, and Guston gets passed in as last. And then we'll substitute this with the first variable. So then this will print. And so we should see a change over here. Instead of professor, it should say prof. So if I execute that, you can see here that it did indeed get this string from when we called the function. So when these are called arguments, and we can pass arguments into a function to make them available inside here. Now if we had other variables in here, let's just say that we set up first to be equal to professor, and let's say last equals Guston. Then instead of using these strings here, I can use this variable first, and I can use this as last. So if I run and test this, this should change back to professor because I changed the variable here, right? And it did update. Now there is a little bit of a difference here. I just wanted to explain that what I'm calling this first here is not necessarily, we don't have to keep the same name here. This is actually a different variable. This would be called a local variable. It's only going to be available inside the function. So let me try changing these just so that you can see. And then down here, let me make this a little wider so we can fit all this on the screen. So we'll do first name and last name. So outside of my function, we have first and last. And this is going to pass first in. When it gets here, it's going to be called first name. And then when last gets passed in, we're going to pass it in as the variable last name. So if I execute this, right, Professor and Guston. So it's keeping the same name. Now let me just change this so we can just make sure that we can see that this is being changed by this information. So if I execute it, then you can see that it is updating from these variables. So let me put these back. And we'll just execute it one more time to make sure that it does update the names. So just to kind of help you see what's going on here, you might think, well, what's the difference in here? We have a variable called first and last. Why do I have to go through passing them in and giving them names in here? Why don't I just use first and last inside here? Well, let's try it. So I go to first, and we'll just take that out. So you might think that it will print the full Professor Guston. So let's execute it. Right, and we get an undefined error message here. Right, it says undefined variable first in and then last in. Undefined means when it gets in here, it's like, I have no idea what you're talking about. I don't know what first and last is. So in PHP, when you create a variable, it's available inside your PHP code, but it doesn't automatically become available inside your functions. And that's why we have the need and the ability to be able to pass things in to a function. And this term is called scope. Scope refers to where you can see a variable, right? So this first and last is available everywhere except in any functions. Now, first name and last name. You might think, okay, in here we created first name and last name. Let me fix these now that we know that that doesn't work. But you might say, well, what happens if we try to print these outside of the function? So let's do an echo, and we'll execute it. So inside, it did correctly display the first name and last name, but then outside first name and last name, it says undefined variable. Let me just comment this out first, and we'll execute it to get rid of those error messages, right? They kind of stayed the same from when they were inside here, right? So the error messages are gone. And now let's take the comment back out and execute it again. Right, so now this is showing back up again. These variables, right, when we create them inside the function, are only available inside the function. So they can only be seen inside here, and then once this curly brace ends for this function, then this first name, last name variables cease to exist. They go away. And so that is called scope, where they can be seen and used. So that's an important concept to keep in mind when you're working with functions. You create the function, and if you pass any variables in and give them new names, then they're only available inside this function. The same thing would be true of if inside the function I create a new variable let's just call it test equals hello world. And then it's outside of here, let's echo test. I'm going to comment this out so that we don't get an error message on that. And let me comment this one out too, so we'll get rid of these error messages and just run it so that we have a clean result to go from. So inside here we're creating test, and then outside of here we're going to try to print it and execute, and we get the undefined variable test. So when we create a variable inside a set of curly braces, the rule is it's only available inside those curly braces. Now another thing that you may want to do, let me get rid of this code down here and just do a fresh run to clean up any error messages. So there are times where you may want to get a value out of a function. Now it could be maybe it's doing some math calculation, or maybe you created a variable in here that you want to send back outside of here. So when you're going to get a value returned, then you set up a variable. Let's just call it hello equals my name. So what will happen is we're going to call this function, pass these in, and then when the function ends, we're going to say, okay, since test isn't available anywhere except in here, but we want to get it back out, then the last statement in our function, we can say return $test. So this will send test back out to where we call the function and then assign it to hello. So we saw that we couldn't just print test, but we could say echo hello. So let's try to execute that. So it still printed the name, and then it printed hello world, and that is coming from this statement. So again, there's a lot going on in here. We have inside the function, we're creating a variable that we just saw isn't available anywhere else outside of the function. But we can get something out of a function by returning it. So a return is going to say take test, whatever the value of it is. Up here we're setting it equal to our variable hello. And then here we're just printing it, but of course you could use it for many other things. Another thing to remember is that once you return something in a function, that it does not continue down to do anything else. So let me take my echo here that I have, and let's move it down. Right, because once it gets to this return statement, that ends the function. It doesn't continue down. So let's just test that. So this my name is, this should not appear, and the only thing that we should get is hello world. So let's execute. Right, so this creates the hello world string. We return it back up here, and then it comes back down and it does this hello. So once this statement executes, it does not continue down. So when you're working in your code, make sure that you don't create what's called unreachable code. It never will get to this line. I hope that overview was helpful.